I don't think a lot of IFB churches, because they are independent, center around a man, unless, like you said, they're in like a Hiles camp or something like that. What a lot of these churches do is they center around Bible colleges
Hmm.
and camps.
Yeah. I think there's two ways that manifests. So there is definitely the Bible college and camps. And I think that's how, as the documentary is being made, that's kind of what I kept telling the director. As I said, it's not like the Catholic Church in terms of, Pope, bishops, whatever order Catholics structure. And I'm not a former
Yeah.
Catholic, but you don't have parishes that are all answering ultimately to the Vatican and the Pope. Like that's not the structure. It's a lot more influence and a lot more circles rather than a triangle. And
Yep.
so, yes, circled around Bible colleges, which again, do I think that's always nefarious? No, I think it's a lot of, people just hiring who they're familiar with. But
Yep.
I think that lack of diversity of thought can create cultish environments.
Yep.
On the other side of this, too, I think the structure of independent fundamental Baptist churches, where it is a singular person in authority with essentially yes men underneath him, um, that to me is essentially lending itself to a dictatorship style of church leadership. And I think it really comes down to when you see some good IFB churches, if you look at the system they're set up in, they just have a benevolent dictator. And the next person
Yep.
that comes in has the opportunity to not be so benevolent and really abuse. And so, that's something that, I think it gets into the system and the structure. And I think when you talk to guys like Stacy Shiflett, who I've spoke to and talked to about this, you know, sure, right now he's in power, but I told him, I said, the next guy could be the next Cameron Giovanelli, the next abusive pastor, because the system hasn't changed. It's
Yep.
still focused on one person steering the ship versus having a plurality of leaders, which granted can also go wrong, as we see in the Southern Baptist Convention. So it's
Yeah.
it's a it's a messy conversation, but I think too often it's easy to go, oh, it's, just because they're not loyal to a college, the system's not bad. But I think
Mm.
any position where there's unchecked power is going to eventually get someone who's going to take advantage of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the church I came from is a good example of that, because we had that setup where it's like, if you vote the pastor in, you go with what he says. If he says, we're going to change the service time, well, we're changing the service time. If he
Mm.
says, we're doing this building project, well, we're doing this building project. And we might even do a church vote. But at that point, who's disagreeing with that?
Yeah,
You almost have to remove the pastor rather than go against what he's saying is his vision for this.
right.
And we had deacons too that could counter, but most of the time it just went with whatever the pastor said goes. And the guy that I was under for a while, I liked him. I think he was a good guy trying his best, but what you said is absolutely the case. I'm going, maybe we lucked out with you. What happens when the next guy comes
Yep.
along and has essentially unchecked power? But there is no easy answer to that, because, like you said, other church government forms uh, run into some of the same issues, just from a
Sure.
different angle.
Right.
Yeah. So not every church is abusive or cult-like, but many are. And certain circles seem to foster this environment more than others do. So what would you say are some of these cultural factors within the IFB that contribute so much to abusive and high control behavior?
Yeah, I think singularity in leadership is the one I mentioned already. I think
Mhm.
treatment of women and teaching regarding women is definitely a major, if not the number one, I would say close second to the singularity of power.
Okay.
I would say it's close second just because it doesn't factor in male victims, which can also happen as a result of,
Mm.
singularity of power. But I would say treatment of women and minors within the
Mm.
church, the fact that women are taught to be literally silent, and I think this goes beyond, before anyone who's listening who's still in gets sidetracked on the should women be pastors question. Beyond that, I would say just the treatment of women in general and the
Yeah.
teachings of, submission in a way that is, I think, you know, I think is abusive in itself. I think when you have women that are told that your role is to be subservient to a man and to be the, you know, as one popular Christian book says, the methadone for his sexual addictions. You're supposed
Mm,
to be barefoot pregnant in the kitchen. You're supposed to, shut your mouth as, when it comes to any issues of disagreement with the man of God, that you're supposed to only address those through your husband. Like,
yeah.
we've put women in a perfect environment to be abused. And I think the
Yes.
same goes for kids. When kids are to be seen, not heard, um, you know, when they have something to share, who do they share it with? So I
Mhm.
think that's a big factor. And then I think ultimately, and they're all kind of converging things, but I think ultimately too, the lack of transparency and willingness to be open about issues. You're not responsible for when something happens in your church. If a church exists for 50 years, there's probably going to be a sex abuse case.
Yeah.
If any business is open for 50 years, there's probably going to be a sex abuse case. Any school, any fill in the blank. Your
Mhm.
responsibility is not, oh, that person did something and I should have been omniscient and known that was going to happen. Your responsibility comes into play with how you deal with it. And I think when
Yes.
you try to sweep it under the rug, you're doing two things. One, you're showing victims they're not safe. You're telling the community they're not safe. But also, you're sending out a beacon letting every other predator know that your church is a safe haven for abuse. And I think that's why you see some of these churches have repeat offenders or, different abusers. One church I just talked, or one group of victims I just talked to has had, I believe it was 10 abusers over a 15-year period.
Wow.
It's a perfect storm essentially for abuse to thrive. When women are silent,
Yeah.
men are given all the power and nobody
Yes.
talks about anything, that's
Dang.
probably not a good thing.
And yeah, 100%. Like if you see a pattern in your church of something like that, you have to start asking why. And even if it's not sexual abuse, like if you have a pattern of staff members leaving or people who, yeah, I'm not talking about the person who comes to church on Christmas and Easter. I'm talking about someone who's there for every service, is out soul winning doing that,
Right.
and they're leaving. You're losing those family. You have to start asking why, because there's a pattern. Maybe it's not sexual abuse, but there's probably something going on with leadership.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Like, how do they feel about what's happening? Yeah. It's
Hmm.
huge.
Absolutely. You mentioned talking about like women in leadership in the church. My church thought that we were progressive because we had a female choir leader. So that gives you some context for
Right.
just the way that women are treated in this one. It's like, oh, we're giving you this. You should be so happy. Really? Come on.
Yeah. Right. Just don't call her a
Um,
worship pastor, just keep
oh,
that
absolutely not. Yeah.
out.
In your Preacher Boys podcast, you have had some really unique opportunities to speak with dozens, probably hundreds now, of survivors of spiritual, sexual abuse, so all different forms. Have you noticed any similarities in these stories where, like, if someone listening to your podcast could relate to X part of these stories, they might be able to say, maybe I experienced spiritual abuse and maybe just didn't even realize it?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a baseline, like invalidating your perspective, there's a lot of stories where somebody shares what happened to them, or they feel like they've been hurt, or they feel like they're experiencing abuse in many cases because they legitimately are.
Yeah.
And there's an invalidation of what they're saying. And it's always, we're sorry you perceive it to be that way.
Yeah.
And I think most anyone who's had similar experiences would resonate with that. Like, you're crazy, you feel
Hmm.
this way, you're digging for stuff, you're bitter, you're this. I think that's probably the baseline. As far as similarity in stories, I mean, they're all shockingly similar to the point it's not
Hmm.
shocking anymore. When I talk to people, it's it's really sad, but most conversations start with them saying, "Oh, I listened to someone else on your show and it sounds exactly like my story." There's
Hmm.
nuances and differences and no two people's experience is the same, but a lot of the way that predators operate is similar. A lot of ways with how churches handle it is unfortunately very similar. And, you know, again, like, it's rare now that I hear a story and go like, "I've never heard that before."
Yeah.
Like, I've had those moments, and some harrowing stories that I've never, that are not common. But for the most part, like, these things play out in very similar ways, similar time spans, similar types of environments, and, I think it's the reason so many people who are survivors connect with others is because they're the only ones that understand that experience the same way.
Mhm.